strongly advised that this was a great school to come to, and I'm here, and very honoured to be invited. And in the dim and distant past, when I was a national schoolboy in 1966, I remember these names as names to read about and admire in all the extreme celebration of the violence, which you have an ambiguous relationship with, I suppose, as arguable. But I remember even then at the age of whatever it was, thinking about these people. So it's a fantastic thing that this school exists, reflecting the desire to retain the memory of these people. And I'm looking forward to this movie at 1:45, so it sounds really interesting, actually. I'm speaking on a topic which is human rights coming to an end. I think the era of human rights coming to an end. I have got an article which is coming out in something called the European Human Rights Law Review. If anybody wants to see it, just send me an email. I'm easy to find on email. And I also have a piece in the New European, which is a marvellous, fanatical pro-Remain newspaper in the United Kingdom. It has all the bad manners of the Daily Mail, but in a good cause. And one of the things it does is it publishes rants by people like me, and I have a piece on European culture in that, which I can also send you. So, if any of you is interested in that, very few remarks I've got time to make today, just send me an email and I'll send these items to you. And I'm very concerned to link my broader questions about the future of human rights. I'm a human rights prof in LSE in London, with the issues that are of direct interest to this day's discussions, borders and belonging, migrants and membership. And I'll start with three situations, two of them rooted in humans and the other as situations. Orban in Hungary. Today's Financial Times has a report on a man, and this is a stark contrast to what we heard about Ireland. And it was a wonderful thing, I have to say, to have that remark about Ireland, because sometimes, wearing my human rights activist hat, we are not quick enough to support good things. And it's really important sometimes to notice the good, so that it's not always about the bad. And I hope there'll be time at some point in this conference to discuss Angela Merkel and the extent to which that extraordinary decision she made 2 years ago is one for which she pays a price, and have people supported her, etc., etc. I think it's a really interesting issue, whether we hold against a person extraordinarily ill-judged interventions on the economic crisis when they come to do something quite remarkable. It's a very interesting debate about the morality of civil society activism, but that's for later. Orban's Hungary is a place where a man who has a guest home expresses a willingness to take immigrants and is basically practically run out of town. There are meetings of opposition. The immigrants are described as utterly and completely non-human. It's like having a bunch of vermin in the place. He's threatened with murder. His tires are punctured the next morning. This is all state-sponsored, media-driven demonization by a government that has calculated that it has benefits in the short to medium term from demonization. And they're also demonizing George Soros, whose money made it possible for their Prime Minister to have his political career. Extraordinary. That's part of Europe still. The second person, obviously, can be moving through quite quickly, is Trump, with his obsessive desire to demonize the immigrant and lunging on anybody who's not a white man. If it's a woman, he lunges at them with one motive. If it's a non-white man, like the estimable mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, it's because he's a Muslim. He can't bear Muslim involvement in civil society. And he is a symbol of our times too. And what has happened with both Orban and Trump is something depressing and relatively new and really germane to the few remarks I'm making this morning. It is that there has been a shift in public discourse along the following lines. The people who are committed to a whites-only approach, who are essentially racist, let's call it what it is, have, until recently, felt that they needed to hide their view behind intellectual activity. And the Australian strategist Linton Crosby came up with this term, the dog whistle. The dog whistle was pioneered in Australia. The dog whistle is when you say something which is not audible, but the message gets through. And that's been a very effective politics for some time, but it's changed. It's no longer now necessary to have the dog whistle. And what I think the enduring legacy of Trump will be has been a vulgarization of politics, which has allowed many, many people who have suppressed their views, mostly white men, of course, entitled white men, but not only entitled white men, now feel authorized by events to argue for that which was previously unarguable. I was at a very pleasant luncheon on Sunday in the Army Navy Club, talking to a very nice woman, former diplomat. She says, as an opening gambit of the conversation, I wouldn't imagine you meet many people like me. I'm a great admirer of Mr. Orban. And it was like having a conversation from the 1930s about somebody who just come back from Nazi Germany. Mr. Hitler's doing a tremendous job. None of my friends mention any of this, as we talked about the media-incited hatred of Jews and of Muslims. Quite extraordinary. That's fairly new, and that's going to be quite hard to eradicate. And it's driven the third of the situations I wanted to begin with, which is, of course, Brexit, mentioned by Carol. Brexit's driver is definitely hatred of the other. They would not have won if they twittered on about the health service, even if they lied about the health service. What got the vote through was the votes against immigrants in areas mainly without them. Now, you all know about that psychology. The fear of the other is more intense where the other is never there. The child hates the monster because he or she has not met the monster. And it's amazing, I live in London, and it's amazing how completely rejected Brexit is in London, because we know what it is to get along. Now, what's going on here is a version of human rights, moving on to the second substantive point, still luxuriating in the non-last 5-minute section of my long talk, is a battle over what is meant by human rights. Now, you might think, oh, it's a very false segue. It's not a false segue. It's not a false segue. There is a version of human rights that utterly underpins racism. And it's the version given to me by the lady and her husband who joined us at the drinks and the lunch on Sunday. And it's the version given to me, are we on the web thing? Let's take a listen. In a debate I did with a man called Douglas Murray in the Edinburgh Book Festival in August. His book is The Strange Death of Europe. And he's determined, Douglas, that his book is not about immigration. He says it's about the loss of the European soul. But all the events he talks about as evidence of loss are of Muslims killing Europeans, of Muslims, white Europeans, of Muslims raping and so on. Breivik is not even in the index. Andrei Breivik. So it's all about how Winters is misunderstood and how Alternative for Deutschland is a better model, etc., etc. These, and it was dispiriting if I may say so. I was signing my book. There are 3 or 4 people here. There was a big long line for Douglas, who's a perfectly nice fellow, and I think believes all of what he says, and cares about culture and so on. And some of them were saying, keep up the good work. And you got this feeling that there was a sense of a new emerging confidence in a certain position. Now, what I'm relating all this to is battles of civilization. This was one of the first consequences of the attacks of 11 September 2001, on which Moore I've got a lot of remarks that I'm not making about where it came from. This idea, what is it that where it came from? This idea that human rights are part of one culture and not another. This idea that human rights belong to the European tradition. This idea that human rights are what we have that they don't have. That is quite a powerful understanding of human rights. So it's what allows you to say non-stupidly that you are in favour of human rights but sign up to no human rights treaties. Now, how can that possibly be? Take the outstanding example, risking the remark, Israel. Israel has created this brilliant idea that you can stand for human rights while ignoring human rights. So it won't sign up to things. It believes it belongs to the European culture, but won't join the Council of Europe out of question, because then a different version of human rights might come into play, the version known in law as the European Convention on Human Rights. With the Americans, after 11 September 2001, a number of scholars wrote books in which they justified inhuman and degrading treatment, mass detention, and on occasion torture, on the basis of a commitment to human rights. That's the way the world works. The world doesn't change radically. The world twists language. And the way they did it was to say, Mr. Bush said it and was told not to say it anymore, we're on a crusade. We're on a crusade against the other. And that's a strong version of human rights. You see it with the egregious Trump, who's able to attack Iran in Saudi Arabia the day after an election for being undemocratic and for its human rights breaches, and is able to attack Cuba for human rights breaches while defending Saudi Arabia. So with Trump's useful because there's no effort at any kind of organized rational connection. But what it shows is how this version of human rights as a cultural attribute rather than a legal phenomenon is the door through which comes modern day racism. And it's getting stronger. It's, as I said, unquestionably the roots of Brexit. Taking back control only up to a point, but taking back control meant getting them out. And it is utterly and completely, therefore, understandable that the British push for Brexit, which is currently heading catastrophically over a cliff, as you may know, involves, nobody really knows very much what it involves, but it definitely involves the rejection of human rights as legal phenomena. It involves the non-adherence to the Charter of Rights, the fundamental charter for the European communities. The Conservative Party, led in inverted commas by Theresa May, is committed to repeal of the Human Rights Act. And it's only because they've wandered out of their depth that they're not doing it. And Mrs. May herself, insofar as she made any intervention during the referendum campaign, promised not only that, but to join Belarus as one of the only European countries not in the European Council, the Council of Europe itself. The only other one is Belarus. And now that, and what will happen after Brexit, if Brexit happens, when business gets a grip of the governmental systems of Britain entirely, and it both disappears and tightens its grip, is all the maternity rights will go on and the holiday pay will go, and the agency entitlement will go, and because there's no other option for Britain. The British link their cultural integrity to human rights. We are a culture of humans, but it's only some humans. And it's the same driving force as we see in Hungary, and I could have said Poland, and as we see in America, in the United States. Now, those are two models of human rights. Two models of human rights. The I'll just put them, I'll put them on the table for you to spot again. One is this cultural model, Israel, America, Britain, and so on. It's us against them. Warrants torture, expulsion, mass detention. Certainly allows you to put up a porta cabin and stick up hundreds of refugees in it because they're not really us. Certainly allow that. And then the second one, in contrast to that, is the legal one. And the legal one's an amazing concept. I used to be really skeptical about law, but I'm much less skeptical. It's an amazing consequence of the victory of universalism in the past. So we embraced universalism, and we have transformed universalist instincts into law, and the law then becomes driven by independent officers who are not buying into vague cultural norms. They are committed, even if they're right-wing, left-wing, centre, doesn't matter, they're committed to text. And the texts say things like, thou shalt not torture, or thou shalt not enslave. And the texts have lots of weaknesses, and they have lots of caveats, and this and that and the other, but they are texts. And where they are enforced, they make a difference. So I'm a believer, having previously been a skeptic, in the importance of human rights law. And I'm a believer in independent judiciary, which I previously castigated as part of the kind of power structure of everyday life, but I think nowadays they stand outside it. And courts increasingly are defending cultures against the worst excesses of populism. It's a fascinating development, how courts have become preservers of democratic value. Incredible. Not always. In South America, they connive with military and business to destroy democracy. Not always, but in a lot of places. There's a third version of human rights, and that is the most energetic, most spirited version of it, which is the activist version. It's about change. Mostly, people are attracted to human rights, not because they want to interpret Section 23A of the Human Rights Commission Amendment Repeal Order, but because they want to make a difference. And make a difference usually means change. And especially since the collapse of socialist language to speak intelligently about the future, human rights has become the language of rational engagement with a better future. And so it's become a mechanism for improvement. And that's not reliance on law as it is, it's an argument for law as it ought to be. And that's been a driving force behind many of the beneficial changes that human rights has achieved. Say, not so long ago, persons with disabilities were invisible. Indigenous peoples, invisible. A bit before that, women, invisible. A bit around the same time, people who are not white, invisible. And the language of human rights is a language through which people are able to express their presence. And what begins as organized, optimistic dissent is regularized into frameworks of international cooperation, which produces international interventions through the estimable United Nations. And then before you know it, we have conventions on the rights of persons with disabilities, or conventions on the rights of people with indigenous peoples, and so on. Now, these may or may not be defective documents, and we may be writing our PhDs criticizing them, but what they are doing is they're feeding into a culture's understanding of the bandwidth of empathy. And so, in some ways, independently of the substantive achievements of the documents, is the momentum of the documents themselves. And that's a kind of counterweight to the version of human rights as culture. And it's very, very important. That's why you hear these people who say, oh, human rights are out of control. It's an awful lot of American white male American lawyers who write these books, including some white males. I'm gendering it, and because this is from people who have academical entitlement. Human rights have gone too far. There was a
a show on Amnesty for about an hour, and they got me on it. They were trying to get me to say human rights have gone too far. Amnesty have gone too far, because Amnesty have burst the banks of civil and political rights and moved into the fields of violence against women, and they've moved into the fields of poverty and so on. Loads of people don't like that. The human rights have gone too far. They should be narrow, civil and political rights. That's what this now is a strongly held view. And what they in fact mean is they want to dissipate the reformist energy of the language of human rights. And they have to resist it. To me, human rights are whatever comment we give them. And that's kind of contradictory, because we start with the assumption that human rights are truth outside politics and society. Well, actually they're not, in all sensible people know that. Human rights are what we make them. So human rights succeed if our society is healthy. Ideas become human rights with the implication of state obligation if our society is able to embrace them. So they become a fabulous activist tool. Now I've said, therefore, you have these three dimensions. To me, the way human rights should operate is there should be an activist energy about a constantly expanding, empathetic circle of people who are noticed, which is a kind of civil society responsibility. And it's articulated as human rights because rights stop at being compassion. If you walk outside there and there's somebody on the street and you give them a 10p or a euro, whatever it is, that's compassion. If they say, I have a right to a home, that's a human right. So it's important to recognize that this is about entitlement, not about compassion. But it depends on political processes. So activism should feed into law, and law should be through mature political engagement, not populism. Populism is a disaster, because it's not populism at all, it's just appealing to the lowest common denominator of them all. And that means it requires political figures to embrace it, and it requires implementation. So you cut out the second version of human rights, the cultural version, and you get from activism to law to enforcement. So you need a bureaucracy of human rights. You need human rights to be concretized in law. There needs to be unglamorous civil service work supporting civil society energy. That, to me, is where our subject should be. Now, the question is whether it's possible. I'm giving you your little pause for 5 minutes. Oh, look, I practically invited it. My timing, I anticipated that was my 5 minute. So I've run out. I was going to tell you it's impossible. I've run out of time. I think it is possible. But very, very briefly. When the human rights idea got going after the Second World War, it was fantastic, we all loved it, etc. Except there are these fundamental flaws in human rights, which didn't matter for a long time, and now they matter a lot, and we need to counter them. The human rights flaws were, one, they're only flaws because they were inevitable. They were inevitable, they were inevitable. The United Nations isn't United Human Rights, it's United Nations. So state sovereignty survived massively, and so human rights have always been linked to state sovereignty. Secondly, the subject of human rights has always been the state that follows them first. So you've always had a situation in international human rights that you've always had national sovereignty been able to trump it, let's face it, and it's always been the responsibility of states to implement. And thirdly, international financial institutions were never part of it. So you've had the United Nations, and the United Nations was supposed to be above stuff, but the international financial institutions, the World Banks and the IMFs and so on, are part of it, as it were. And so these were oddities in the human rights construction. How could you have human rights where you have national sovereignty, where you have no obligations on individuals to respect human rights, but only obligations on states, and when there are these operations outside states that are immune to human rights judgment, the IMFs and so on. Now, not a lot. This we muddled through with this, and then a couple of big things happened in this century. At the 11th September 2001 and the financial collapse, and these two combined to expose the weaknesses in human rights and make this thing difficult. 11th September 2001, basically empowered states to fight back against everybody in the name of counterterrorism. So the United Nations, there's lots of time to discuss all this later, so I'll run it through quickly now. The United Nations created its own bureaucracy of counter-terror, which trumps or tries to trump the bureaucracy of human rights. So September 11, 2001 is important because it created a rival bureaucracy at UN levels for basically downgrading human rights in the name of the protection of the state from terrorism. And it's of course depressing for us all to see the way in which the language of terrorism is used so glibly by states now to underpin attacks on the human rights of people, not the least of them being migrants and refugees. And it's done now often with the support of important UN committees. And secondly, in 2007-8, the international financial institutions were going in tremendously damaging the life chances of hundreds of millions of people, not least in Europe, and they are not the focus of any kind of human rights control because they're not doing it, the countries are doing it. So you have Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and so on, operating as states, but shadow states, obeying instructions from others, and of course there's a European dimension here too, also immune to human rights control. And so the result is, in short, that the human rights language was perceived, with the rise of so-called populism, to be part of the problem rather than part of the answer. And therefore, in a very bizarre way, when the attacks on immigrants and on minorities and so on get underway, with the rise of Trump and Orban and the like, of Brexit, human rights is packaged as part of what is wrong with globalism. So human rights, which should be an answer to the malign impacts of globalism, which should be the other side of globalism, becomes part of the problem. In that immortal, disgraceful remark, which nearly caused the governor of the Bank of England to resign. If you're a citizen, if you're not a citizen of here, you're a citizen of nowhere. So attacking the whole idea of a global citizen, Theresa May, at one of her party conferences. Now, this was supposed to be the year, 2017. This is my last remark. We're being very generous with your interpretation of 300 seconds. This was supposed to be the year where human rights of the type that I believe in were finally eclipsed. And my goodness, if you were lived in Britain, the BBC were getting ready. We had Trump, we had the rise, we had Brexit, and we were supposed to have the collapse of Austria, the collapse of Hungary. They were all getting ready for Marine Le Pen. They were preparing for it. And the Brexit thing was going to be justified by the dissolution of Europe, by its collapse back into a whole series of rival, racist, populist entities. And this is my very last set of remarks. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. Italy did not collapse when they had that silly referendum and the chat went. Most importantly, my personal favourite, Austria. Very few people noticed it, but they had the usual beautiful, young, surrounded by sort of wolfhounds guy running for president, and they had this 74-year-old green guy who said, "I would like to be president," and he won. And then they set aside the election, not malevolently, and he won again. That's pretty good. And then you had that guy whom the media talk about constantly in the Netherlands, who was supposed to break into government and everything with his smooth hair and his raised head, and he lost. And then Marine Le Pen was supposed to win, and thank heavens the right wing collapsed. And whatever you think about Macron, I'd love a discussion at this conference to be what our view of Macron and Merkel is actually, is soft Le Pen, and of course the British media have made a huge fuss about Alternative for Deutschland. They are really serious. What they show us, I think, is that Eastern Germany has not been able to develop in the way that good old West Germany did. But Angela Merkel won. Angela Merkel won. So we have this powerful chance for Europe, it's an unpopular point maybe in Ireland, but maybe not, for Europe to emerge as the custodians of human rights now. And that is a really big deal for me. And I think it's beholds us all to be European cosmopolitans. I feel quite strongly about it. I wrote this long piece in the New European this extreme anti-Brexit political paper about European culture. And I said, European culture isn't Beethoven, that's German, European culture isn't football, it's not singing, that's ABBA and all that. European culture is something new, and it's only defined in adversity. You don't have a culture because Valéry Giscard d'Estaing tells you you have a culture. You don't have a culture because a committee of European MPs tells you to have a culture. Your culture grows in adversity. And continental Europe looked a return to the calamity of the nation state in the face. And lots and lots of people, including old people, but mainly young people, decided to stop. And what's that culture? That culture is a commitment to equal respect and the rule of law. Really funny thing. There could literally be a culture about what these things mean. So you can be extremely critical of Europe. My goodness, you can write plays about troikas, you can castigate its conduct towards Greece. But my goodness, let's be careful before we join the right in trying to destroy it. Thank you very much.